Hello, this is Jeff Boggs, and this is the Week 8 lecture for Geography and Tourism Studies 2P21, Introduction to Research Design and Methodology. Last week, we talked about coding, C-O-D-I-N-G, and then I also introduced some notions about networks, connectivity tables. Frankly, you're more likely to use coding than the material on networks, but I still think the material on networks is kind of cool. All we are going to do this week is talk about surveys, survey questionnaires, and how to write them. So we are going to discuss how to conduct surveys, which are a means of collecting data. And they're actually amenable to sometimes some of the techniques from coding, at least when you have open-ended questions. But they're especially amenable to analysis using some of the techniques we talked about, I think 2 weeks ago, when we talked about sort of basic forms of quantitative analysis. Because you want to remember that survey questionnaires, most of the time, the data they collect is quantitative. Spickard introduces 6 steps. Develop a good research question, choose a corresponding logical structure. There are 10 of those. Identify the type of data that you need. There are 14 types of those, and surveys can provide some of these. Pick a data collection method. So a survey questionnaire is one kind of data collection method. There are 12, according to Spickard, types of data collection methods. Then you're going to choose your site and your sampling strategy. We'll say a bit about this sort of incidentally as this lecture progresses. And then we will say a bit about the data analysis method. But actually, for this lecture, we'll say less about how to analyze these data and more about how do you set up a survey questionnaire so that you collect data that you actually can easily interpret. Because if you have junky data, or bad data, it's quite hard to interpret and in turn answer your research question. Your textbook, so this textbook by Spickard, provides concrete examples of how to use survey questionnaires in a couple of different chapters. One is chapter 7, where he writes about acquiring economic, demographic, and organizational data. So org here means organizational data. In the 8th chapter, he talks about using surveys as one way to collect data on shallow opinions, as well as data on identities, and also reports of acts, behaviors, and events, I believe is how that ends. And then again in chapter 11, he talks about using survey questionnaires as one way to collect data on acts, behaviors, and events, and reports of acts, behaviors, and events. Having read Spickard, you are aware of the distinction between a survey and a survey questionnaire, or sometimes people say questionnaire. I have giggling people in the background, so kindly ignore them. So the survey is really, when we talk about a survey, we are often talking about the procedure that's used to select a sample, to distribute and complete a questionnaire. So it's the procedure through which we figure out, okay, given that a particular group is our population that we are interested in, how do we sample from that population so that they will then complete the questionnaire and provide us the data that we are interested in? The questionnaire then is the instrument used to collect the data. And sometimes, I can't recall if Spickard says this, but in many other textbooks and articles that you'll read, questionnaires are sometimes referred to as survey instruments, just because it's a way to collect the data. So remember, the instrument is the way that we collect the data, and a questionnaire or a survey questionnaire is one way that we can do this. In common English, survey is often used synonymously for both the procedure but also for the instrument. So that can be a bit confusing. In writing your proposal, you'll want to distinguish between those so that your bleary-eyed marker, that would be myself or the TA, actually understands what you mean when you say survey or you say questionnaire or survey questionnaire. Failure to do so could result in lower marks if your writing isn't particularly clear. You have been warned. Okay, let us move on to the next slide. There are three uses of survey data, or we might also say three ways to analyze survey data. And if you'll recall the lecture from about 2 weeks ago, I think it was chapter 6 or thereabouts, we talked about ways to analyze quantitative data. So the first is that we can describe a population or a sample. So we could provide a survey to an entire population. If we did that, that would really be a census. Or we could provide a survey to a sample of the population. And regardless of which way, regardless of whether we're fortunate enough to get everyone in the population to fill out the survey or just a subset, we can use these data to describe the characteristics of either the population, if it's a census that we actually ran or conducted, or if it's a random sample, we can use that to describe the characteristics of the population. If it's, however, a non-random sample, then this still allows us, these survey data still allow us to describe the characteristics of that sample, but not generalized to the larger population from which that sample is drawn. And this is all related back to the differences between random and non-random samples. If you're a bit fuzzy on that, I think we talked about that during week 6. So go back and have a gander at that stuff. The second way that we can use survey data to conduct an analysis is to use it to compare two or more parts of a population or a sample. And the third way is that we can use it to reveal associations for correlational research. So it's likely that the first use might be good for descriptive research, which I believe is one of Spickard's 10 categories, but actually it might work well for case studies and a couple of other of his logical structures. If we look at the third item here, we can use it to reveal associations for correlational research. So remember that Spickard's 10 logical structures, I think his fourth one is correlational research. And actually, ex post facto research sometimes makes use of associations as well. Remember, an association is if two things two variables, in fact, are associated if, for instance, one value gets larger while the other one tends to always get smaller, or tends to also always get larger as well. Again, you might want to go back and look at the week 6 material that discusses this. Surveys. So the procedure of conducting a survey, so using a survey questionnaire or a survey instrument to collect your data, tend to have, regardless of who your sample or your population is, tend to have 3 common features. The first is that most of the time, the data that you get from a survey is quantitative data. It is not qualitative data. The only time it might be qualitative is if there is an open-ended question on the survey. These data, so these quantitative data from a survey, usually take one of 3 forms. So it will tend to be either interval or ratio level data. So for instance, how much money do you earn in a year, or how old are you? It might be ordinal, in which you're asking the survey participant to rank something. So would you say, so when we get to Likert scales or Likert scales, there's sort of a debate about the pronunciation. But with ordinal, we often see that in terms of, would you say that you completely agree, you mostly agree, you neither agree nor disagree, you, slightly disagree, or you completely disagree. That's not completely parallel. I can't remember what the initial 2 categories were, but you get the idea of a Likert scale and how that can be ordinal. You might also ask people in a survey, to rank, from these 5 items, what, rank them from 1 to 5, and with 1 being the most important in the feature that you look for in a pet dog, for instance. It may well also be that some of the data you collect are nominal, or which Spickard annoyingly refers to as categorical data, even though a lot of people would argue that categorical data includes ordinal data, but we're not going to go there. So nominal data might be data about citizenship or ethnicity or racial category or something along those terms, right? So it's an unrankable answer. So, in what province were you born if you were born in Canada? And then there would, in what province or territory were you born if you were born in Canada, is a question that then we would expect to see 13 possible responses. And in that case, you can only be born, I suppose your mother could have gone into labor on the boundary, the border between 2 provinces, and you could technically then be born in, 2 neighboring provinces or territories. The likelihood of that happening is almost 0. So most of the time, for a lot of questions, not always though, but for a lot of times, responses, or I guess answers to survey questionnaires, to a particular question on a survey questionnaire, will sometimes, the respondent will just be able to make one choice, right? Okay. Another point about surveys is that the data are usually collected at the individual unit of observation. You'll remember from, again, I think about 2, maybe 3 weeks ago, we make a distinction between unit of observation and unit of analysis. And that if you have individual observations, and let's say that you have survey responses from people that live in all 13 provinces and territories, you could aggregate those individual responses by province or territory. However, you can't go backwards. So if somehow you collected data at just the level of the province or territory, you cannot then, disaggregate that into individual units of observation. The nice thing then about surveys is that because they usually produce individual units of observation, this gives you a couple of different ways to think about aggregating your data up, to perhaps a particular group or to a particular location. So it might be that your survey asks questions about people's education level, and you could then group people by education level. Or it might be that your survey asks questions about, people's birthplace or some other locational marker. And in that case, you could also aggregate your individual responses by location. Let's talk a little bit about the best practice in administering questionnaires. So these are the things that you want to keep in mind before you even write your questionnaire. You want to think about these sorts of things. So if you're going to engage in random sampling, you need some kind of sampling frame. Because that sampling frame, be it a list or a grid, or there's a couple of other ways to do them, that provides you some notion of the probability that each element in the population can be selected. Some examples of this are things like membership lists. If you were interested in the opinion of shop owners in downtown Peterborough, and you would be interested in that because it might relate to your research question, it could very well be that all of those shop owners belong to a local business, often a business improvement district is what it would be, I believe, in the province of Ontario, and there then should be a list of all of those businesses. You could use that list as a sampling frame. Another sort of sampling frame is something called random digit dialing, and I've worked on a project where we used that before, but we hired a survey firm to actually run the random digits and then complete all the phone calls. I wouldn't expect you to do that for Peterborough, but the thing about random digit dialing is that if you know what the area code is, and especially then if you know the sort of 3-digit code in between the area code and the 4 digits, so it's often a kind of a local code. Knowing those, then, for instance, if the area code were 905, and then the next sort of local code is, for the sake of argument, we'll say 999, then there should be 1,000 other, actually not 1,000, there should be 10,000 other combinations that you could call. If you go from 0000 all the way up to 9999. That's basically how random digit dialing works. But we're not going to go into that too much. So random digit dialing then is just constrained by combinations of 3-digit area codes, 3-digit telephone prefixes, and then you have 4 random digits that are selected. So if you know the 3-digit area code and the 3-digit telephone prefix, and you know that in, for instance, 905, for the sake of argument, has 3 three-digit telephone prefixes 000, 555, and 999, I'm just making those numbers up, then there should be a total of 30,000 potential numbers that could be called, because for each of those combinations of 905 plus 000, then within that sort of string of numbers, there's actually 10,000 possible combinations as you go from 0000 to 9999. And then if you repeat that for 905 555 and 905 999, again, I'm making those up, but you get the idea. Then for each of those, there should be 10,000 additional possible telephone numbers. And then through that, you can call to find out, is this a household or is this a business? And it may be that you want households, or it may be that you want businesses. And then from those, as you dial through there, and often this takes, if you've ever worked in a call center, this is some of how your calls have been assigned if you are engaged in survey research, is that a machine will then randomly select within these parameters a phone number, and you will call somebody probably during their dinner time, and they'll be grumpy, but they might actually also then respond to your survey. Okay. A phone book is an old-fashioned way to come up with a sampling frame. So to the degree that people still list their phone numbers in phone books, that is a useful sampling frame, because for nothing else, the yellow pages will often have businesses. Well, the yellow pages in North American phone books, and actually in German phone books as well, so I suspect this is a convention throughout lots of Europe, and perhaps in other countries as well, that the yellow pages are basically a business directory. So the yellow pages in a phone book will contain the telephone numbers for businesses. And the cool thing about the phone book, at least the yellow pages, is that it's basically organized by industry, which is kind of nice. And so that can be used as a way to construct a sampling frame as well. Trade directories, and this is something that I've used in the past. So a trade directory is kind of like a membership list, except that the members are usually businesses. So those are common sampling frames, at least in terms of economic geography questions. And so for people interested in tourism studies, if you're interested in speaking with individuals who run a tourism-focused business, these might be, especially phone books and trade directories, might be useful ways to identify your sampling frame. If it's non-random sampling, then you don't really have a sampling frame per se, and instead the site and the type of sampling procedure that you're using is going to determine who ends up in your sample. But it's useful to think about these before you run out and start handing out survey questionnaires. So that was sort of my, I don't know if admonition is quite the right word, but what I would see as best practice that you need to think about when you're administering or thinking about who your target population is that you're going to draw your sample from. That's what the previous slide is about. Many of the rest of these slides are really about the nitty-gritty of designing your questionnaire so you collect the data that you are interested in. Because nothing sucks more, actually, I suppose some things do, but it's a wretched feeling to know that you've spent a lot of time designing a questionnaire and then one of your questions was poorly written or God forbid, a typographical error renders it sort of an incomprehensible question. That is really unfortunate with that when that happens, let me tell you. So the first admonition is to ask only one question at a time. So when you're writing questions, make sure that that question that you are writing is just one question and isn't sort of two or more questions bundled together. Because people find it much easier to answer one question than two questions that are bundled together. Let me give you an example. Here is a question that is not one question. It's, do you drive to work daily and become lost? By adding the word and in there, it creates this added layer of complexity. So it might be that someone doesn't drive to work every day, but they still become lost maybe every time they go to work. How are they supposed to answer this question, right? So they don't drive to work daily, but they do become lost every time they go. So they would have to say no. But if you're more interested in how frequently people become lost when they're going to work, this question is not going to help you. Instead, you might ask, do you drive to work daily? And so that is the first part of the previous question. And then ask, do you get lost daily? Or some variation of that. And the benefit of this is that you can now disentangle the people who do and don't drive to work daily from those who do and don't get lost daily. You want to think about, in this case, how each question corresponds to one variable. The second admonition is to ask unambiguous questions. And an admonition is an old geezer term for like advice, I suppose. Actually, it's a bit stronger than advice. Anyway, ask unambiguous questions. So ask clear questions. Here is a question that is ambiguous. It is not clear. Question 1, do you drive to work daily and become lost? We can rephrase that to be, do you get lost when driving to work daily? The first question, do you drive to work daily and become lost, doesn't get at kind of the frequency at which you become, or the frequency with which the respondent gets lost. Whereas the revision of this question, if we really are interested in how often people get lost when they're driving to work, lets us better get at that. So do you get lost when driving to work daily? And actually, we could probably even chop that into how often. So one way to rephrase this might be, how often do you get lost when driving to work? And we could have some selections under there, like, at least once a week, every time, at least once a month, or variations like that. So maybe once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, 4 times a week, 5 times a week. Might be ways to go about that. Or at least once a week, at least once a day, at least once a month, at least once a season, right? So they're, depending on the time period we're interested in, we could develop a question that's even better than the one that we have here, which is asking basically for a yes or no response. So the point here is that you want to know what you want to ask. And what you want to ask are questions that when you pull them all together and look at the different responses that you get, the collection of these responses will then provide an answer to your research question. So always keep that in mind when you're devising your survey questionnaire. Another admonition is to use a Likert or a Likert scale, at least when it's appropriate. So here's a question. How comfortable do you feel driving to work? A lot? I mean, that sounds kind of weird already with comfortable. A little. Uncomfortable, right? So these responses, these three responses don't really fit together in the same way that the Likert scale set of responses might. And these three responses make it difficult for the respondent to sort of answer in a way that is consistent from respondent to respondent, or at least is likely to be consistent from respondent to respondent. So these are bad. Instead, we might try something like, very comfortable, comfortable, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. Some people will write neutral, but neutral sort of breaks this up. You really want to say, you want to include both, if you will, the positive and the negative aspects that you're getting at. So uncomfortable, and then very uncomfortable. This is an example of a Likert scale or a Likert scale. And you've seen these before. The nice thing about asking questions using a Likert scale is that it makes it easier for, first of all, the respondent to sort of gauge their own feeling, or I guess their own response to the question, but it also then makes it easier to compare between respondents. I mean, it still doesn't get at the issue of, is my comfortable the same as your comfortable, or is my comfortable really the same as your very uncomfortable? There are actually ways to get at that as well. We're not going to bother with that. And for your third-year expedition to Peterborough, you don't need to worry about that either. So the benefit of using a Likert scale or a Likert scale like this is that it makes it easy for your reader to respond, and it makes it easy for you to compare between different participants. When I said reader, I actually meant participants. Let's move on to the next one. The next admonition is to ask key information first. And by this, I really mean information that's going to help you decide whether this person belongs in your sample or not. Because you don't want to collect data from people that actually are not in your sample, or that are not in your intended sample. So you want to think about, who is it that you would like to have fill out this survey questionnaire? And then you want to insert questions early on that allow you to confirm that the people taking the survey are actually the kinds of people that you want to collect information from. This is a question from a survey that I helped work on and analyze a couple of years ago. It was a project PEPIN. I think it was Poverty and Employment Precarity in Niagara. If you Google PEPIN.ca, the website might come up for that. And if you put my last name in there, you'll see kind of a cool website that our web guru came up with for that project. But this question, we were interested in precarious employment, and we weren't to be precariously employed, you have to be employed. If you are not currently employed or employed during the time that we were asking about, then you don't count as precariously employed. You are unemployed. So our first question was, did you work for pay or profit at any time for the first 3 months of 2017, i.e. January, February, and March? And with this question, we first of all wanted to know, when people were called through random digit dialing, did they work during those 3 months? If they worked, then the answer is yes, and then they might be, well, I guess at that point, then that is the kind of people that we wanted to talk to for our survey. If they didn't work, then they were not precariously employed. They were, in fact, unemployed, and we didn't want responses from unemployed people. So this question allowed us to get at, to ensure that the people who, well, assuming they were telling the truth, and most of the time, if people are willing to take a survey on the phone, they are generally going to tell you the truth. Not always, but most of the time. This allowed us to determine whether or not, the participant fit into the group of people we wanted to collect data on. Okay, we'll stop at that one. Oh, and so the point here of this is you want to get the appropriate respondents. You want to make sure that the people that end up in your sample, or the things that end up in your sample, are the ones of interest for your research question. It's the same thing as if you, I suppose a weird parallel here might be if you set up a little trap, or maybe not a trap, but you have a little cage and the entrance to it is small enough to keep out turtles that are beyond a certain size. And it might be that, on average, turtles beyond a certain size are over a year old. So it might be, this isn't really a survey, but this is a similar idea as to, controlling who falls into your sample. If you had a trap and the entrance to that trap was small enough that only turtles who were small enough to probably be a year or less in age, if only those kinds of turtles then make it into your trap, and then after they're trapped, then you draw their blood, you weigh them, you might check to see what their species is or other sorts of things, see if they have any particular diseases. That sort of initial screening, if you will, make sure that you get the people, or in this case, the turtles, if you want turtles that are less than a year old at least, make sure that you get the right individuals in your sample. Another admonition when you're designing a survey questionnaire is that if you have to use technical terms, explain them so that your participants know what you mean by these terms. Because you want to make sure that people are asking the question, that people are answering the question that you're actually answering and not some other question. So this is again where piloting, that's the fancy term for test driving your survey instrument. You want to make sure that you pilot your survey so that these kinds of glitches get worked out. Let me give an example. So in the Pepin survey, we had some questions about volunteering, and volunteering means different things to different people, right? So like, does going to go volunteer to fight against the fascists in the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939, is that volunteering in the way that I mean it, when we created this survey? Or is that something else, right? So volunteering, we defined what it meant. So it involves applying, actually, this survey was developed with the help of another survey instrument. So these questions, this definition might have actually originally come from Dr. Wayne Luchek at McMaster, because we used a survey instrument he had created and then modified it a little bit. So like adding the previous question that you saw. But in this case, we used someone else's, many questions from someone else's survey, which then also makes it, our results are then comparable with their results. And so what we did was then define volunteering. So volunteering involves applying your expertise, ideas, energy, and labor to support an organization without being paid. With that in mind, and then we had a barrage of questions after that. Oh, such as the fourth question, between April 1st of 2016 and March 31st of 2017, so that's a year, right? How many hours per month did you volunteer on average? If it was greater than 0, then they got the fifth question. If they didn't volunteer any hours or the average was 0, then we would skip to question 6, right? So the skip part, you might want to keep those in mind as well. But really the point here is you want to explain technical terms so that the people that take your survey know what you mean when you say volunteer, or in this case, volunteer. And the point of this is that you explain these so they do not misunderstand the question. It's helpful to also provide a brief description of the project. This is usually provided in an introduction letter and the consent form if you're using introduction letters. And the consent form is required by Brock University. So basically you will need written consent from your participants. And you'll provide a brief form that sort of explains the study, and then they check it and they keep it. If they consent, right? If they don't consent, then they don't get the survey. And you want to describe what you're doing with this research project using the clearest, the plainest language that you can. And the reason that you describe your project is that you want the respondents to know why you want their data. So you don't want them thinking that you're some kind of criminal that's going to use this data to, rob their bank account or break into their house or steal their dog and hold it ransom, or God knows what else. So you want to be clear and transparent about why you want their data. And then you want them to provide consent. And if they don't provide consent, then they don't take the survey. These introduction letters are sometimes those are built into the consent form, and sometimes those are separate. So next year, when you go to Peterborough, as you're preparing for that, if you are going to interact with human subjects, then you'll learn some more about that. A common bit of advice for survey questionnaire design is that you want to ask demographic questions either right at the beginning of the survey questionnaire or as the last thing that is asked. You want demographic questions because they allow you to understand how your sample compares to the more general population. So, and you can find out, about the general population sometimes using Statistics Canada data, and whether this is the survey, I guess the National Household Survey, or even just basic demographics from the census itself, or it could be a series of other surveys that Statistics Canada will, during the year roll out. We're not going to go into details on those. It could also be that someone else has conducted similar research, and you know that their findings were that dog owners tended to be males and females between the ages of 15 and 45 years old, right? Demographic questions are things like sex, age, ethnicity, race, birthplace, nationality or citizenship, occupation, education, those kinds of questions, right? And let's come back here to this notion of first or last. So we ask demographic questions first to, I guess, colloquially speaking, to break the ice. So that can help the participant feel more comfortable in the survey. Or if you end the survey questionnaire with demographic questions are usually fairly easy to answer and are not going to be mentally draining. Most people can remember how old they are or where they were born, right? So that's the sort of rationale for asking demographic questions either first or last. When it's relevant, you also should consider using categories as potential responses to your questions that have been developed by Stats Canada, or so when I write Stats Can, that's short for Statistics Canada. So here's an example of a survey question that we used in the Pepin report, or sorry, in the Pepin survey instrument. So the 24th question was, what degrees, certificates, or diplomas, or equivalents have you obtained? And then here we also indicate that multiple responses are okay. So Statistics Canada, when they talk about education, talk about secondary or high school diplomas or equivalents. So a GED is in the US an equivalent of a high school diploma. So apprenticeships or trade certificates or diplomas is another educational category. College, cégep, so that's sort of like a Quebecer grade 13 university preparation program, as I understand it. So college degrees, cégep completions, or other non-university certificate or diploma. So this category then is catching everything that isn't an apprenticeship or a trade certificate or a diploma, and that also is not a university degree. And then we have university certificate or diploma below bachelor level. So this might be, I don't see these very common in Canada, but there is something called an associate's degree, which is sometimes given as a kind of a 2-year degree. University certificate or diploma at bachelor level, that is what most of you are applying for. University certificate or diploma above bachelor level, So this could be a degree in medicine, so an MD. In dentistry, I can't remember the initials for dentist, but they have their own initials. Veterinary medicine, they also have their own initials. Or optometry, so those are eye doctors. Also a master's degree, so an MA or an MSc, or an earned doctorate, which I'm not sure how that differs. Oh, okay. An earned doctorate is different from a doctorate that is sort of granted on a, we think this person is great, so our university is going to give them an honorary doctorate, right? So an earned doctorate is different from an honorary doctorate. And then none of the above. So these are all the choices that can be selected from in that survey that we ran. And these categories line up identically with the 2016, and actually I think the 2011, and I also believe the 2006 and the 2001 and the 1996 and probably 1991 and maybe even further back than that, categories used by Statistics Canada. So this let us then say something about the respondents to our random sample that were providing information about precarious employment in Niagara. This allowed us to see to what degree did our respondents' educational characteristics differ from those of, the average Canadian in Niagara. It also makes your life easier and your respondents or your participants' lives easier if you group similar questions together. That's because if you ask somebody demographic questions, for instance, so if you ask somebody questions about their sex, often when people are asked about their sex, then they are often asked about their ethnicity or their age or their education. And so demographic questions provide an example of what I mean by similar questions. This helps maintain the logical flow and helps your participants stay on track. So for instance, keep all your demographic questions together. But beyond those, you want to sort your questions by theme as well. So it might be that in your lit review, you've identified 1 or 2 or 3 themes that you wish to explore, that you wish to gather data on. And in those cases, you might then for each theme have like 3 or 5 or 40. Don't actually do that in Peterborough. You might have 5 or 6 questions about a particular theme, and you want to keep all of those together. You also, I think this is the last slide, is that you want to ask as few questions as possible. People that are responding to your survey questionnaire, like they're doing that probably out of the goodness of their heart. You don't want to ask them a bunch of superfluous questions that don't actually do anything for your research question, right? So you want to make sure that the questions that you ask are the key questions, or they're questions that provide data for key variables that help you then answer your research question. You may well be aware from your own experience that people often prefer to, if they're going to participate in a survey questionnaire, they're much more likely to participate in a short one than a long one. It's another reason why you want to think about what questions do you really need. So a useful rule of thumb is if the question doesn't provide you a measure of an important variable, don't include it. And remember, and you know this from your own experiences because you've all been harassed by people with questionnaires, is that shorter questionnaires are more likely to be completed than are longer questionnaires. And the reason then that we want to ask as few questions as possible or as necessary is that this improves not only your response rate, but also your completion rate. Your response rate refers to the number of, like, you can think of that as the difference between, I asked 40 people to complete this survey and 10 of them did. If I have 10 responses out of 40 people that I ask, that is a 25% response rate. The benefit of having a higher response rate is that it often means that you need to actually, for lack of better words, pester fewer other people, right? The completion rate is the number of people who have not only started, but completed the survey. You'll want to decide what you're going to do with incomplete surveys, but you hopefully will have a completion rate that's very close to 100%. Just because that makes your life so much easier to have all of your participants, if all of your participants have all answered all of the questions. And I believe this is everything for this week. Yes.